everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Hydrogen has the greatest potential long-term to redesign the aircraft, do the safety work. We're looking at 10 or 15 years minimum. So what's going to happen is the continued electrification of all electric aircraft on small sizes and general aviation, and then hybrid models. And we're doing that with existing aircraft that are pure fuel and making them hybrid and all electric, and then building new aircraft that are all electric, then eVTOL. And then that fourth phase, I think, Scott, that's where the hydrogen kicks in. And it's going to be effective, cost effective operationally, but someone has to spend probably, in my opinion, $5 to $10 billion of major design.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Vance Hilderman, CEO of AFuzion. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Vance, you've trained over 31,000 engineers at over 700 aviation companies. Can you give us a high-level breadth of training and the kinds of training that you've done?
Certainly, Scott. It's interesting. And training is a small part of our business, but we're the largest in that area. Aviation companies, they develop very complex systems. And these systems cost $5 billion for one Boeing aircraft, one Airbus aircraft. Smaller aircraft could be $1 billion. So to save money, to make these certifiable, more deterministic, and always 10 times safer than any other form of transportation, we have a lot of special rules for aviation. It's part of what we call the Aviation Development Ecosystem. That's the title of my latest book, in fact. So our 50 engineers train, mentor, audit engineers throughout the world, and it's a guarantee that anyone who's flown on a commercial aircraft in the last 20 years has used our company's technology and training and many other aspects.
Amazing, amazing. Now, there is a lot of changes happening. Again, aviation is a pretty large category, but I think if you really take into account the changes in the last 10 years, we're seeing drones. And when I say drones, there's a really huge diversity and spectrum of drones, things that can carry very large cargo to things that are very small, to eVTOLs, to unmanned aerial systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, and really electric vehicle, as well as even hydrogen for that matter. How do all these technologies play into the work that you're doing?
Well, we're involved with all of them, and it's quite interesting. Everyone loves Tom Cruise, perhaps, certainly in the movies, and Top Gun is all the rage, that's the sequel. Well, movies are a big business in America. There are many billions of dollars overall in exports, but aviation does more in a month than entire Hollywood movies in a year. It seems to be aviation a less than glamorous business, but all those topics you talk about are really attracting the best and brightest, quite literally. Where there's hundreds of billions of dollars, and it is hundreds of billions with a B, it attracts a lot of smart people. So all of those new aspects of propulsion, eVTOL, urban air mobility, UAVs, we're involved with many of those, probably the top 10 major players in eVTOL, and there are over 130 aircraft developments underway for eVTOL. It's very soon. They're flying right now, the prototypes. You can go to various airports and watch them if you'd like. You're going to be able to dial up, just like Uber, a little more expensive Lyft, and get your own ride. Cargo deliveries. We have now electrified aircraft. Folks, they're flying today. The first one was Pipistrel out of Little Slovenia. They've just been bought by TekSci, huge billion-dollar corporation. That was the first all-electric aircraft, and we helped certify that. So it's really coming. It's really sexy, and it doesn't make it on primetime news. So, Scott, we're glad to spread the word on your podcast here.
Super. And with those new categories, let's say, and new innovations, it's also going to require different types of skill set, things maybe that wasn't necessarily really known for within aviation, different types of robotics, different types of artificial intelligence, different types of sensors. How are those need for different skill set also affecting your business and the kinds of knowledge transfer, expertise, and the training that you provide?
It's a great point. If technology is already available, it doesn't need engineering, it just needs purchasing, okay? Most of those new technologies don't require purchasing, it's engineering. So 80% of the new jobs in aviation are for activities that did not exist 10 years ago. Cybersecurity is a large one. AI, swarming drones, automated delivery. Amazon, it's coming, okay? You'll have that delivery drop right in your yard or at a nearby depot. Well, we have to do things to make those safe. So the AI, the urban planning, the infrastructure, even the eVTOL, it's very sexy. It's very cool. It's kind of like the computers in 1980. They were really cool, but they didn't do much until Microsoft, Apple came along and gave them the power, if you will, the informational engine. Well, that's what we're doing now with aviation, the avionics. As I mentioned, it's billions of dollars of new development. So engineers, we really need to encourage the STEMs, the science, technology, engineering, math. We need there today, for the first time in my 35 years, there is not a single unemployed aviation engineer. We are really looking all over for engineers. We're taking them out of history majors, business majors, and turning them into good engineers because smart people can do smart things.
Now, one of the areas that we haven't talked about is the space economy. And again, it's kind of borderline aviation, but fundamentally it still is, right? So you got the rocket propulsion, but eventually spacecraft that can fly to outer space and come back as well. How does that play into kind of the big picture?
It's really cool. There's three major space tourism companies. There's Virgin Galactic, Branson. You've got Elon with SpaceX and Mr. Bezos with Blue Origin. And we're working with two of those companies. We can't tell which ones. There's really tight non-disclosure agreements. But we're also working with NASA on manned space satellites for space repair, space reconnaissance for, in a good way, civil way. We're working with Maxar, the world's largest commercial satellite company, to blend that spacecraft, low Earth orbit, high Earth orbit satellites and giving them the safety records. You know, look at our space shuttle. We blew up 2 out of 5 of them. You had a 98.7% chance of living. Well, that's not real good for space tourism. So we can do better, and we are. And we're in the process of making space travel almost as safe as regular commercial air travel, which is 10 times safer per passenger mile kilometer.
So this is a good segue to talk about the importance of safety development for every type of aircraft. And again, we've specifically intentionally talked about the different classifications for that reason. And safety also corresponds to regulation as well. And I wonder if you could give us a picture of where is the regulation staying pretty much a little bit in step with innovation, and where the areas that it's perhaps maybe lagging behind.
It's a great question. You know, in aviation, we like leading edge, but not bleeding edge. FAA, EASA are doing, EASA is the European Aviation Safety Agency, the equivalent of FAA. They're keeping up on the forefront and really pushing safety. We have a concept called single point failure. And on a large aircraft, the probability of single point failure that causes a crash is less than 1 times 10 to the minus 9th. Now, that might not mean anything to an average listener, but if you think about it, 1 times 10 to the minus 9th means, oh my goodness, it will never, ever happen. That means a software system single failure that causes a crash will never happen. It's the only industry that guarantees that. So we have to build that in. There's a whole lexicon of strange sounding words. My wife laughs at these letters and numbers, things like DO 178, DO 254, ARP 4754. An American listener knows what 401k means. It's a savings vehicle. Europeans, Asians, they don't know what that means, but in aviation, every engineer knows what ARPDO means, and those are the strict standards, hundreds of pages that software, hardware systems have to apply with, and many companies, the majority, use our ecosystem. It's kind of like a Lego building blocks out of the box to help comply with those things. But the flying public can be very assured that we're doing everything to maximize that safety and keep it down to that 1 times 10 to the minus 9th number.
Now, that's certainly true for commercial airplanes, but once we get into the smaller crafts, things that's more for hobbyists or single engine propeller types of planes, the regulation as well as the technology isn't quite there. Isn't that right?
That is true. In fact, the regulations for experimental aircraft in the U.S., the majority of new aircraft being flown per year are in the category of experimental, folks. You cannot pay for a ride. You can't take passengers. It's purely experimental. There's not a guarantee of safety. They're pretty safe, slightly better than cars, but 10 times less safe than a large commercial aircraft. Okay, and in space, the rules are less formal. We're formalizing them now, but they are not as official. So you're right. We're working on those. We're improving it. And that's where the avionics come in. Many times we prototype new avionics systems and deploy them to the general aviation where it's easier to fly because we don't have these 71 objectives of software certification that apply. So we're actually using that experimental realm to improve overall safety, much like Mercedes, Ferrari, when they go to the Formula One races. You're not really buying those cars, but they're using that knowledge, that learning to make better cars faster, more economical, and interesting things in that regard. So it's similar, I think, Scott.
Great. So let's transition the conversation to 5G. 5G, of course, from on the ground, whether it's manufacturing, telco, healthcare, it's become much more pervasive, and certainly there's a high degree of adoption. And again, that's at the ground base. But when we talk about interstate and flight that spans potentially thousands of miles, how is 5G affecting avionics and aviation, and what has been the adoption like?
It's really interesting. Today's air travelers want better connectivity. I spend, an inordinate amount of time. 2 weeks ago, I was in Sweden working with Heart Aerospace on electric aircraft. Next week, I'll be in Korea, another project. So a lot of time in the air. I want connectivity. We want phone calls. Aircraft want to be connected. We have the new Iridium satellite system, and my former company did a lot of work on the original Iridium. Iridium's being used not just to connect aircraft and ground, but also to track aircraft. The MH370, the lost, hijacked, who knows what happened. Well, folks, read the French report. The French were very thorough. The new aircraft that we have are using the new Iridium system to track the location of every aircraft within 3 feet. 3 feet, folks, that's the distance between row 12 and row 10 on the aircraft, okay? So we know where they are, and all that is happening through communications. Now, there's some interesting issues with 5G because the way the U.S. didn't do a great job of coordinating with industry, FAA, and the players. We have a small chance of interference right at 4.2 gigahertz. The Europeans were a little more conservative. That's the way they are over there, tighter airspace, different culture. And they don't have that. They didn't release that part of the spectrum. So there is some interference potential near airports with 5G, but we're resolving that. We're working on that. But it's a very fast-paced changing aspect that we need to address.
So you talked about 4.2 gigahertz, and again, this interference with cross connections such as radar, satellite networks, airborne bases. And how is that potentially disabling critical functions from a command control linked to 5G?
Yeah, it's a great question. Imagine you're going to a concert and it's really dark and you hear a sound and it's a bulb and you're not quite sure if it's a bass drum or a trombone. Now, when the flute goes, you know it's a flute. But there's very tight similarity between that bass drum and that trombone at about, let's say, 60, 70 hertz. The human ear goes down about 15, 20 hertz, okay? Well, that's interference. That trombone and that bass drum could actually be indecipherable. Well, we have the same thing with radar altimeters in the aircraft. The radar altimeter is using 4.2 gigahertz to communicate with the ground. Now, on a sunny day like we have here in Los Angeles, where I am, that's not an issue. The pilot can see the runway. But when we have that Hemingway night, Ernest Hemingway, it was a dark and stormy night. You're coming in for a landing. Maybe you've got a less experienced pilot, but he's licensed, she's licensed, they're flying, they're not real experienced, and now they're relying on that radar altimeter, and all of a sudden they're getting a signal. Is that a trombone bum or a drum bum? It could interfere right at that frequency range, and that's the issue.
And in that regard, what is being done in terms of either better noise signal processing to decipher what the origination is, and so you get the proper signal and the interpretation of that, or is there actually training being done to accommodate some of these challenges?
It's all those things. We could easily add what we call bypass filters. Any basic electronics engineer could do that in a matter of hours on an aircraft. Unfortunately, it's years to redesign and recertify. It's a major change, and that would take a couple of years to recertify. So we don't do that one. Instead, it's the training. It's the disabling of the 5G antennas really close to key American airports where there could be that interference. So we're doing the combination of those things. Eventually, we'll have the avionics that won't interfere. That's going to take a few years.
Interesting. So just to be very clear, again, you mentioned Iridium satellites, and again, that's kind of the dominant service provider. However, does 5G actually play into providing services for avionics? And if so, how? And I think you mentioned, or you're going to mention Internet of Things as well, right?
Yeah, we're trying to deploy. You've got companies like different companies that are providing different communication backbones. We know that the current system the connectivity is quite lagging. The original Iridium system had very low bandwidth. It was great for what we had at the time, voice communications and text messaging. It doesn't take too much history to know that in ancient times, otherwise known as 40 years ago, we didn't have cell phones. I'm holding up this iPhone 13 Pro Max thing, and folks, this has more processing power than the entire Apollo program, including NASA Houston ground control, right? Well, there was a thing called pagers, and we actually communicated with pagers. Well, that's the era of Iridium, okay? So the fact we had voice communications is incredible. Well, that doesn't do it. Now we want full streaming, high definition video capability on the aircraft. So we're building out that infrastructure to do that, and that will include 5G. It's going to be a few more years. Again, we have that certification thing that it always doubles the amount of engineering time and cost, but that's what keeps things safe.
And just pragmatically understanding, so 5G is typically work from a cell tower aspects and looks for the closest and the strongest signal. So if a aircraft is flying across, like I say, interstate, how is it able to make sure that it's automatically identifying the strongest tower signal? And what happens if there are dead spots?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we do have dead spots, including especially transatlantic, South Indian Ocean, a lot of dead spots out there. That's where the satellite systems, the alternative backup systems come in. It will be degraded fidelity, degraded bandwidth in those cases, but the avionics are improving to recognize that and use secondary. We can do a lot of buffering, not on a voice communication. For example, I'm talking slow, it's kind of bothersome. What happened to his voice, right? Well, with voice, we can't really buffer it as well. You want to see the mouth moving with the voice, but with video, we can buffer. So there's a lot of things we can do with video, a lot of communications, a lot of browsing internet usage that we can buffer and circumvent, mitigate, not solve, but mitigate a lot of the issues with dead space.
Interesting. Let's briefly talk about Starlink. And Starlink, of course, is trying to create a constellation to provide broadband across the globe. I'm sure they're in the plans to also make it 5G compatible as well. What does that mean for avionics? And certainly, it's a step up from the Iridium and low band, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. You see the Starlink. We can see it in our Arizona house. A little less, ambient light. Here in Los Angeles, we don't really see that, But you can see Starlink in certain times of day, and that means it's low Earth orbit. You're not actually seeing the satellite fly, but you're seeing the reflection of the sun at that typically dusk time of day. Some people have seen it early dawn. I have not. But that's a low Earth orbit. The reason it's LEO, as we call it, low Earth orbit, is because of the latency times. If we're at high orbit geosynchronous, where the satellite seems to rotate at the same speed of the surface of the Earth, so it's always seemingly stationary, it's too long. You can't have real-time communications. Well, with LEO, Starlink, and its high bandwidth, there's so many of them, right? Hundreds and now thousands eventually. We will have full connectivity in the new, improved, upgraded 5G anywhere, including on the aircraft. And Elon's a pretty sharp guy here in California. We like Elon. There's some issues with Starlink. It's certainly making space more crowded. We track everything that flies, including satellites, rockets, not small Piper Cessna aircraft, but in Class A, Class B airspace up in space, we are tracking it. And Starlink is definitely crowding things up a bit. And let me ask our listeners, do we think that Starlink is going to be the final low Earth orbit communication system? Oh, no. There are several others under development. It's a big market. Folks with money want better communications. Folks that don't have access. Many parts of Africa, South America, mountainous areas in Asia, they don't have cell phone coverage. So Starlink gives them coverage, and the cost is quite effective.
So from that point of view, from an avionics perspective, this is going to be a huge win, is it not? And then what are the challenges in terms of retrofitting both from a device and software so that these planes can actually take advantage of it?
It's a really good point. We're going to have to upgrade and also add new equipment. Now, when we add new equipment, you might think, ooh, are we interfering? For example, holding up my cell phone. All of our viewers know that you're not allowed to use this cell phone during takeoff and landing. And many of you think maybe, and perhaps you read it, you can read anything, these things interfere with navigation, right? Well, that's not true, okay? There's never been a reported, factual, verified case of these cell phones interfering. Oh yeah, go ahead and check that out. The reason is since 1959, we have a thing called, oh no, another acronym, DO-160. It's the environmental testing. It's shake it, bake it, try to break it. Okay, that's what we joke about. It's also EMF, RF. All of those 110 different avionics systems on a commercial aircraft and 50 on a small aircraft, they've all been certified to DO-160, environmental testing. So they are not affected. However, that's because DO-160 today doesn't include 5G interference. If it did, we wouldn't have had that radar altimeter problem. So we're going to have to go back and update DO-160, update the avionics, and ultimately retest and build special capabilities so that we have good 5G compatibility.
That's very interesting. Of course, as we know, we've gone from LTE, 4G, 5G, and already working on 6G. So this problem is just going to only continue. So it really becomes a continuous process improvement, right?
It does. And the FAA is a great organization, terribly funded on an annual basis. Folks, annual funding might work for your household, but not really. That's not how you make the mortgage payment, right? All of you have at least a 5-year plan, I hope. Well, the FAA can't. And so that's the challenge. We need a little better infrastructure, coordination. And now, when your home is burglarized or you've lost your data, that's when you start making backups or get an alarm system. Now this 5G radar altimeter situation has really forced its hand. Now we know in FAA industry, we're going to have to coordinate a lot better through ICAO, the International Aviation Entity. It's kind of the United Nations of Aviation. So now we know, I don't think we're going to have such a big problem in the future. We've wisened up a little bit.
Good. My last question for you is if you could share maybe a case study of how your firm has been working with a company.
Oh, happy to. Yeah, a little company by the name of Pipistrel came to us 4 years ago in Slovenia, of all places, right? And that's interesting. They wanted to build the world's first all-electric aircraft. So they came to our training. We analyzed their gaps. They bought our framework. And we worked with them to improve their safety process of all-electric. There's some issues with all-electric aircraft. They're different issues than fuel-powered aircraft. And so in a short 3 years later, they achieved full certification as the world's first certification of an all-electric aircraft. And they've sold 1,000 aircraft, and they're selling these things as fast as they can produce. All electric, zero carbon footprint, except for the manufacturing of that electricity, of course. So you've always got some footprint there. but very effective. Reasonable range, reasonable payload, and we're doing the same with Heart Aerospace in Sweden. They're going to travel 200 miles, 300 kilometers with 40 people. That's very cost effective, all electric, and there's hybrids. So it's really coming. It's happening out there, and many of those companies rely on our company, AFuzion. So we're really pleased to be in this space.
All right. So I do have one more follow-up question based on that, is that based on what you're seeing, because again, you're very much at the forefront of the product development along with these startups and pioneers, where do you think things are going to go with electric versus hydrogen or hybrid for that matter?
Ooh, we're doing some cool things with hybrid. Electric's underway. Hydrogen has the greatest potential long-term. Hydrogen has always had potential, okay? When I was a kid in the 60s, we'd have flying cars. Well, it was 60 years later till we finally have flying cars, practical flying cars, okay? Well, same thing with hydrogen. To put hydrogen and power it on an aircraft, we can do that fairly easily. We could be flying next year. To redesign the aircraft, do the safety work, we're looking at 10 or 15 years minimum. So what's going to happen is the continued electrification of all electric aircraft on small sizes and general aviation, and then hybrid models. And we're doing that with existing aircraft that are pure fuel and making them hybrid and all electric, and then building new aircraft that are all electric, then eVTOL. And then that fourth phase, I think, Scott, that's where the hydrogen kicks in. And it's going to be effective, cost effective operationally, but someone has to spend, probably in my opinion, $5 to $10 billion of major design. It's similar to supersonic, but we'll have to talk again. But supersonic makes a lot of sense until that first finance of the R&D has to be handled. So that's the issue with hydrogen, that first $5 billion of R&D, and then everybody can follow. But it's not going to happen that way. It's going to go electric, small, electric, large, hybrid, and then hydrogen.
Great insight. Very, very helpful insight, actually. So with that, I've been joined by Vance Hilderman, CEO of AFuzion. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.